Yeah. Yo, what are you doing? Pick up the pace. Get busy. Do it.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Sega CD review here on Player One Start. In the previous parts of this series, we took a look at the history of the console, and we took a look at the hardware, graphics, and sound. Oh yeah, and if this is your first time here, don't forget to click that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when I make future posts in this series. In this video, we're actually going to start diving into the games and showing off some of the gameplay. And I thought the perfect place to start with this would be with the launch games. So let's go ahead and take a look at the launch of the Sega CD before we dive into the games. For the Sega CD's launch in the US, Sega was bound and determined not to repeat the mistakes it made with the launch of the Mega CD in Japan. Sega held a press conference in New York on October 15th to launch the console, giving the press a preview of the system. There were 20 games planned for the launch window, with a further 24 leading up to spring of 1993. For the first 6 months of the Sega CD's launch, it was packed in with a 2-disc compilation set containing Sega Classics Arcade Collection, which just combined 4 different cartridge games, Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Columns, and The Revenge of Shinobi, as well as a second disc containing Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, Volume 1, as well as a separate box for Sol-Feace, making a grand total of 5 different games technically, which Sega of America touted was an over $300 value in itself, which, considering what you would have to do to buy those games separately at the time, was probably about right. To further improve over Sega of Japan's launch, Sega of America devoted roughly 1/3 of its research and development workforce to Sega CD products. As a result of this decision, Sega's American arm became the largest developer of Sega CD software across the globe, overtaking Sega of Japan, which were struggling to keep the add-on afloat in their native territory. Sega of America President Tom Kalinske outlined 5 different types of Sega CD games, the first being the Value Disc, which would be a compilation of 4 to 6 Sega Genesis titles previously released on cartridge. Another type which he called Enhanced Cartridges, which would act as enhanced versions of a cartridge game, usually with better sound effects and/or more levels. He also described interactive cinema games, which became known as full-motion video games. He also talked about unique animation games, which didn't have an example, but most likely he was referring to polygon-based games, as he said that this will be the first time players will be able to interact with true computer graphics rather than bitmapped images. The last type of game he described was a type of entertainment that he said defied definition, with the prime examples being cited were the make-your-own-music videos. So based on these genres defined by the president of Sega himself, I decided to go ahead and structure my review in this fashion, rather than trying to go through the typical video game genres. And also another note about how I do the ultimate reviews. First off, while I do a lot of research to kind of showcase some of the best games and some of the most recognizable games, as well as a few hidden gems, I am often limited to how many games I can collect for a system before I put out the ultimate review. And in the case of the Sega CD, the average price per game, even for loose titles, is a bit on the high side, somewhere ranging between $30 to $50 for loose titles, and $50 to hundreds of dollars for complete in-box titles. And this is a system I actually like to collect complete in-box, and that is also another hindrance because a lot of these cases are very fragile and hence have not survived well. Another thing to keep in mind is that you are not likely to run across a wide variety of Sega CD titles, as a lot of these games can be very rare. Luckily, I do live near a couple of retro game stores that specialize in locating these exceptionally rare items, however, they also have the price to match. So yeah, Sega kind of had to do everything their own way in the 90s. I mean, yeah, they copied a lot of what other people did and tried to make it their own, but in this case, they kind of redefined what genres the Sega CD would be built for. And to tell you the truth, it's strangely accurate for the type of games that came out. So rather than go through like action and then adventure and then puzzles and all that stuff, I'm actually just going to use their genres to kind of show you what the Sega CD was built to do and what it ended up putting out there. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive into some of the games. There were about 10 games available at launch. Let's go ahead and do a quick overview before we dive into each one.
Looks like you're not up to this mission. Breaking contact.
I'm going to start out by showing you the boot process in real time. So as you can see, it takes about 25 seconds for the console to actually boot into the opening logos. And depending on the game developer, you could either skip the videos or you had to watch them each time you booted the game. Thankfully in this case, Sega had a very short intro and we topped out at about 34 seconds. Well, to start out with, the Sega Classics Arcade Collection would have been a great game for those that were brand new to the Sega Genesis. However, if you played these games before on the Sega Genesis, you may be sorely disappointed because these are the same exact games, except for some minor differences. Some differences noted by other gamers was that the version of Revenge of Shinobi in this collection only included the Spider-Man boss fight, with Godzilla and Batman being replaced with substitute enemies. Golden Axe is the only game in this collection that has external CD audio, and I feel compelled to say how much I prefer this to the actual Sega Genesis soundtrack. Let's listen to a couple of comparisons. other than the sound differences, this game plays exactly the same. The same goes for Streets of Rage, which I have also already covered in the Ultimate Sega Genesis review, so I'm just going to show a couple of samples of here. The only difference I could tell was that the digitized voices benefit from the extra capacity of CD audio. Moving on to Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective, this is the first game where you really feel the loading times as the single-speed drive struggles to keep up. But anyway, in this game, a full-motion video starts out each case that you pick.
What rubbish! What balderdash!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
And it depicts Holmes and Watson meeting a client and learning a few background clues about the case. The player must then visit a particular location or person, read the newspaper, or ask one of the young Baker Street irregulars to investigate. The object of each case is to gather enough clues in the shortest time possible, then go before a judge who will ask the player to answer important questions about the case. If the player is successful, a full-motion video clip will take the player back to Holmes and Watson's study, where they will review the events that transpired, and Dr. Watson will inform the player of his or her score based on the length of the time it took to solve the case. Overall, this game is okay if you like point-and-click puzzle adventure games, but this is not really my cup of tea. The video quality is poor by today's standards, and the production quality was poor by standards back then, with some reviewers noting that the video production quality seemed to be that of low-end television. As a launch title, it definitely does show the possibility of making full-motion video games on the platform. However, I feel that the subject matter may not appeal to all types of gamers. If I would have got this included with my Sega CD along with the other games at launch, I wouldn't have been too disappointed. However, if I bought this separately, I would have been massively disappointed.
Accuracy. We find this publication to be of invaluable assistance in our investigations, and I'm sure you will as well.
Game Creative Staff, Wolf Team.
Wow, what an intro. So Sol-Feace is a horizontally scrolling shooter. Controlling the starship, the player is tasked with preventing a malfunctioning supercomputer before it enslaves all of mankind. The objective in each stage is to destroy the incoming enemies and avoid their projectiles. The Sol-Feace starship has a pair of dual cannons that can be modified to point either forward, backwards, or diagonally, and can be arranged in parallel to each other. To power up your ship's weapons, you can shoot small capsules that float around the screen, and they will leave behind power-up items. These can include homing missiles, piercing lasers, and a wide shot. The game is composed of 6 stages. Each of these end with a boss fight that must be defeated in order to progress. The boss fights require you to figure out where a weak point is that can be shot at to inflict damage. In between each stage are animated cutscenes that help explain the game's plot, complete with full voice acting. At the time of its release, Sol-Feace was met with mixed reviews from critics. Some praised the game's visuals, fast-paced gameplay and soundtrack, but others criticized its lack of originality and for being subpar when compared to other shoot-'em-up titles available at the time. However, I personally think this is one of the better of the launch titles that I have played for this system. This game fully utilizes the extra sprite count and scaling and rotation. Granted, I don't think it's the best shooter that you can get on this platform, but it's pretty far up there, and I'd rank this at around a B+, A- kind of a title.
The year 2160 AD. It is a time when Earth's technology enables mankind to send spaceships on missions to other planets. The Earth's population and its accompanying urbanization created a need for raw materials in the building of skyscrapers and underground cities. Eventually, the planet's natural resources were unable to meet the demand of its growing population. And in order to solve mankind's need for natural resources, a number of exploratory missions have been sent to other planets in search of valuable raw materials.
So I'm not quite sure how, but that opening story description somehow leads to one of the worst fighting games I've ever played. So basically, the objective in the single-player mode of this game is that you fight 8 different enemies in the form of giant robots. Each battle between the player and the enemy takes place over 1 round, and you only have 5 continues if you lose. There is a timer on each match, and if that runs out, your player's machine blows up. So if you think this game looks fun, what went wrong? I found the game boring and uninteresting. The gameplay didn't really keep me engaged, the graphics are okay for a Sega CD title, the soundtrack leaves something to be desired, at least from my point of view, and one of the reviews when this game was released called the game pure, unadulterated tedium. And to tell you the truth, there's no way I can top that. That basically sums up this game for me. Cobra Command, also known as Thunderstorm in Japan, is an interactive movie game originally released by Data East in 1984 as a Laserdisc-based coin-operated arcade game. This port was developed by Wolf Team and was released in 1992, again as a launch title in North America. So basically this game is an interactive movie where the player watches scenes as a helicopter flies by the zone of conflict. The game screen is represented by the helicopter's cockpit, and the player controls crosshairs that can be moved to aim at the enemy forces. The player can either fire a machine gun or missiles. In certain points of the game, you must move the D-pad into a certain direction so that your helicopter will not crash and explode into the surrounding scenery. If at any point in the gameplay you make a mistake, there's an animated sequence that shows the Cobra helicopter blown up and the player loses a life. If all lives are lost, the game over screen appears, and the Cobra is in smoldering ruins. And from my experience, you will see this screen a lot unless you have all of the obstacles memorized. And that's pretty much what this game really comes down to. How fast can you memorize all of the game's obstacles? Because it plays the same every single time you play the game. While the game is a bit visually impressive for basically looking like you're playing through a cartoon, I have to say the gameplay mechanics got really tiring really quickly and just became very tedious. I think this game would have been great to rent over a weekend back in the day, and then you could challenge your friends to see how far you could each make it into the game or try to beat each other's high score, and then return it to the video game store so you can pick up another title that may keep your interest a bit longer. Overall, I'd rate this title at about a solid C. It's not terrible, but it's not the best game I've played by any means. And it does kind of recreate that era of video games where laserdiscs were used in arcades, so if you're a fan of that type of playing style, this game might not be too big of a disappointment for you. It is unfortunate that I can't play any of the audio from these Make My Video games because it'll get flagged for copyright, but the only thing I'm going to say here is that this is not really a video game at all. This is purely a gimmicky type of game for people who are fans of this music back in the day, and I'm not even sure if you were a fan of this music today that you would want to go back and play these games, because the audio quality is a bit poor, the video quality is very poor, so I wouldn't recommend going out of your way to collect these unless you're going for the full set.
Birds were singing, weather was fine. Chuck Rock settled down, waiting for the rock game to start. Things had never been better for Chuck.
Chuck Rock was originally released in 1991, developed by Core Design for the Atari ST and Amiga computers. The game takes place in a fantasy prehistorical Stone Age era that is shared by Neanderthals, woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs, and various assorted wild primeval monsters. Chuck himself is an overweight, square-jawed caveman character who is defined by loutish and lewd behavior, perhaps influenced by the lad culture in the UK in the 1990s. Chuck wanders around each stage and only has a basic set of moves, which basically boil down to lift, jump, and belly bump / attack. Chuck can pick up various types of food to increase his score, or collect hearts which increase his health. But basically aside from that, your main goal is just to make it to the end of each stage. There are also some puzzle elements to the game where certain rocks are used to reach higher areas, and some prehistoric creatures must help Chuck get to certain other parts of the level. Overall, it's a solid platformer, but I would also rank this around the C title, basically being another standard platformer, only this time on the Sega CD. This game was also available on the Sega Genesis, but again, its soundtrack is much improved on the Sega CD, in my opinion. Sewer Shark, which was eventually packed into the Model 2 Sega CD, is basically an on-rail shooter. It's on-rail because, well, all of the game's graphics are full-motion video. And again, this is almost exactly like Cobra Command, where all you have to do is just memorize where the targets are at, because it shouldn't change with each playthrough.
Hey, relax. Pretend it's a game.
A couple of interesting notes is that the video footage in this game were directed by visual effects artist John Dykstra, who had previously worked on films like Star Wars. This game was also originally developed for a cancelled VHS-based ControlVision video game console, but eventually found a home on the Sega CD. And possibly due to it being a pack-in title for the Model 2 Sega CD, this game is one of the best-selling Sega CD games that were ever released for the console. And although it was well received at the time, again, I am not a fan of this type of action. It did initially provide me with some entertainment, but that quickly faded away once I found out that the gameplay is more or less just memorizing where obstacles are and trying to get to the end of each level. I would rate this title today at a solid D. It has a high production value, but leaves me with very little entertainment to show for it. And the last launch title that it leaves me with is Night Trap. No one can argue that this is probably one of the most influential games in video game history, as it was cited as one of the examples for the formation of the ESRB. However, prior to its exposure in the media, the game wasn't really selling well, and actually got a huge boost in sales specifically because it was touted as one of the most graphic and horrifying games of all time. And to tell you the truth, although there are some strange events in this game, I'm not sure if I agree with that opinion. I mean, true, it could be that I'm playing the edited down version, but I would consider the stuff that happens in this game pretty mild by today's standards. And also, if you've never played this game, I would say consider yourself lucky. Basically, this is a game of just searching around different camera feeds that you can see and just guessing what you're supposed to do. There are no hints, tips, or tricks, you just have to try to figure it out for yourself and see what works. Now, I've heard the Switch version is a lot easier because they've built in some things that make it a little more obvious what you're supposed to do. But as for the original on Sega CD, all I can say is I am not a fan of the gameplay. There's really no appeal to me, other than this game's status in video game history. So do I think it's worth the price being charged for it on the collector's market? I don't think so. You can definitely pass on this one, unless you're just going for the game collection, or if you want a historic piece in your collection. So how does the launch lineup of the Sega CD here in the United States stack up? Well, first I'm going to say I think that this is a good amount of titles for a system launch. I'm not quite sure if the variety of titles would appeal to all gamers, but I think what came with the system would at least be enough to get people started. I think the sad thing, though, is that I think the best games that would have been packed into the original Model 1 would have been the Genesis titles. That and Sol-Feace, which Sol-Feace was kind of an unexpected treat for me. To tell you the truth, this is one of those games that I hadn't really heard of until I started doing research for this video series. and that was just something I wasn't really expecting. I didn't consider myself a fan of all the scrolling shooter games until I started playing the Sega Genesis, because there are a lot of good shooters on there, and Sol-Feace, while not the best, is a good example on the Sega CD, and probably would have been one of my favorite titles had I got this console at launch. The Make My video games would not appeal to me back then. I actually found them a bit humorous today, but unfortunately I can't play any of the audio from those games, so I had to skip over those. I think some of the titles that would have drove home one of the big selling points of this console back when it launched would have been those FMV titles that showcased the games that were previously on Laserdisc in the arcades. Because that was a genre that had yet to make it into the home, and this is the first time, at least that I can recall, that these titles would have been in the home. Now, in my personal opinion, these game titles lack a bit in gameplay and are only meant for short bursts, not for playing through an entire home game experience. But this is another example of how Sega tried to bring the arcade experience home, so that is something I think was actually a good thing for Sega to include at launch. Overall, though, I think the only thing that is missing from the launch lineup is that killer app, the one that would have just made people flock to the Sega CD. It is very strange that Sega of America and Sega of Japan didn't really cooperate well with one another. They were almost at odds with each other. And I think that if Sega of America had really had full control over the launch of the Sega CD in North America, they probably would have launched it with a Sonic game. And I think that is what this console needed to spur strong sales off quickly. And unfortunately, that just didn't happen. It would actually take until the next year for a Sonic game to be released for the platform. But that said, in the next video, we're actually going to move past the launch games and start looking at games based on the genres that Sega had defined. So stay tuned for that video. Remember, if you like what you see, please hit that like button. Also, leave a comment below. Let me know what you liked about today's video. Let me know what you'd like to see in the future. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, because I have more Ultimate Sega CD review coming, as well as other content. And I'll see you on the next one. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Also, if you enjoy the content of this channel, please remember to click on this subscribe button. Again, I want to thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.